Merci beaucoup. So I am going to try to cut to the chase. In this study, we looked at why are farmers using agroecology practices, or why are they not using agroecology practices? And to answer this question, we drew on 89 focus group discussions with farmers. So this is data from farmers, farmer perspectives, and 6 cases for the focus group discussions. And this is just a reminder, we actually drew the practices on cards in pictures. And then we asked them, are farmers in this area using this practice? Is it common or not? And then why are farmers not using it, or why are they using it? This doesn't want to go forward now. So why are they using it, or why are they not using it? And we learned that in the majority of these study cases, there were people using soil and water conservation. They were using various ways of improving the soil fertility, and they were doing things like intercropping or crop rotation to diversify their cropping system. And there were some that were really focused on things like agroforestry or home gardening. So there is a range of different agroecological practices that people were doing. And in terms of the main barriers that farmers named, for those practices that were not common, the main barriers were, the most frequently mentioned barriers were knowledge and labor. And the main barriers that were for those practices that were common, the most frequent mentioned was labor. And this suggests that some farmers were able to overcome this barrier. We found that the barriers varied by practice. So even though knowledge and labor were the most frequently mentioned, in actual fact, for labor, it was only for 2 types of practice. Knowledge, it was more common for different practice types, so 5 different practices. But then we also had the most frequent barrier for a particular practice that was different. So for example, social networks was an important barrier for managing livestock differently, for managing them in an agroecological way. In terms of what were the main drivers or motivations, and this builds on what we heard from Rick Coe earlier, the improvement of soil health and the protection of soil conservation were some of the main drivers, but they weren't always enough of a driver for people to use those practices. Instead, it was those practices that improved yield, food security, and income that were mentioned as the main drivers for a number of practices that were commonly used. And we also found that these drivers varied by practice. And so some practices were known to improve income, some practices reduced the cost of farming. So there were different drivers based on practice. And so when you combine these 2 sets of variables, you find that for a given practice, you might have, for example, seed saving, production cost was a main motivation, reducing the cost of purchasing seeds, but the barrier to using it was knowledge. Whereas integrating animals into your system, increased income from that diversified production was one of the main motivations. And again, knowledge of how to do that was sometimes a barrier. We're talking as though there's one driver or barrier for a given practice, but in fact, it's multiple benefits and multiple barriers that often operate in reality. So for example, crop fertilization, there were, yes, motivation to improve soil health, but also things like increased yield, improved food security, increased income, and even social cohesion were listed as motivations for using that practice. So in conclusion, we found that both drivers and barriers varied by practice and by context. The most common barrier for those not using an agroecological practice was knowledge. Labor was the most common barrier for some practices, but farmers can overcome that. And we drew that conclusion because farmers who were commonly using that practice mentioned that labor was an initial barrier. And we found that food security, yield, and income were some of the important drivers for using agroecological practices. Farmers recognized and valued the ecological services that agroecological practices provided, but those weren't always enough for them to use those practices unless it was multiple benefits from those practices that they derived. So we recommend, because of this finding around knowledge and the context-specific nature of agroecology, that participatory research that draws on farmer knowledge in place and adapts the agroecological practices to that context is really what we recommend going forward, and to adapt to think about multiple desired outcomes from agroecological practices in terms of policies and programs to support them in order to ensure that farmers are really benefiting from those practices. Thank you.